The gun was already in Alfred Garrett's hand when Winifred Merriweather stepped off the porch and planted herself between him and the man who had come to take everything. "Move," Alfred said, his voice low and stripped of anything that could be called warmth. 7 years of silence had made it that way, hard as the packed earth of the Texas Panhandle, dry as the canyon wind that never stopped pushing against the walls of the house he'd built board by board with his own bleeding hands. "I will not move," Winifred said. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there in the amber wash of the late afternoon sun, her dark hair loose from its pins, her dress still carrying the flower she'd been using when she heard the horses come over the ridge. 7 days. She had been on this land exactly 7 days, and she was already willing to stand between a loaded Colt revolver and the man she was beginning to suspect she could love more fiercely than she had ever loved anything in her life. Harlan Coop sat his horse 20 feet away and watched the scene with the patient satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. He had a deed in his coat pocket, a fraudulent one, but in 1883 in Tascosa County, fraudulent deeds had a way of becoming very real depending on whose hands you greased. "Garrett," Coop said pleasantly, "I've got papers. I've got the sheriff coming, and I've got 8 men behind me. You've got 1 woman and a grudge. I'd say the arithmetic favors me." Alfred's jaw tightened. He could feel Winifred's shoulder almost touching his chest. She smelled like flour and wood smoke, and something he had no word for, something that had been missing from this land for 7 brutal years. He could feel it now, the way you can feel a fire through a window without touching the glass. "The papers are forged," Winifred said, loud enough for every man on those horses to hear, "and I can prove it." That was the moment everything fractured and rearranged. That was the moment Alfred Garrett, who had held this land alone through drought and rustlers and grief and silence, and the particular madness of too many years without another human voice. That was the moment he understood that the woman standing in front of his gun was not simply a stranger who had arrived on a stagecoach with a single trunk and a letter of introduction. She was something he had stopped believing in. He had stopped believing in a great many things 7 years ago. It had begun in the autumn of 1876, when Alfred Garrett rode into the Texas Panhandle with $43, a borrowed horse, a deed to 312 acres of raw country that most men considered worthless, and a name, Eleanor Voss, written inside the front cover of his Bible. Eleanor was to have been his wife. They had written letters for 8 months. He had described the land in those letters with a careful, restrained passion that surprised even himself. He had told her about the way the grass went silver in the wind, about the particular quality of the light in October, about the creek that ran cold even in August if you knew where to dig for it. Eleanor had written back in a precise, looping hand. She was from Cincinnati. She had never seen open country. She said she wasn't afraid of it. She said she was ready. She had not come. The letter arrived 2 weeks after the stagecoach brought no one. Apologetic, brief. She had married someone else, a lawyer with a house already built, with neighbors and a church and no possibility of rattlesnakes. Alfred had read the letter once, folded it carefully, placed it in the stove, and watched it burn. Then he had gone back to work. 7 years of work. 7 years of fence posts and cattle and a house that grew slowly from 1 room to 4, from raw lumber to something solid and real. He had hired hands who came and went with the seasons, to Ma's raise, who stayed 3 years and was honest and good, old Pete McKenzie, who lasted 2 winters before his knees gave out. There were others. None of them counted as company, not in the way Alfred had stopped allowing himself to want. He became known in Tascosa as a man of few words and good cattle and a fair price. People respected him in the manner you respect a cliff face, with admiration for its steadiness and the unspoken understanding that there was no point in trying to get close to it. Then, on the 14th of September, 1883, a letter arrived at the Tascosa post office addressed to him in handwriting he did not recognize. It had come from a woman in Kansas City named Winifred Merriweather. The letter was not what he expected. He had not expected anything. He hadn't placed an advertisement, had not written to any matrimonial agency, had not spoken a word to anyone about loneliness or the particular hollow sound a house makes at night when you are the only person in it. The letter had come through an arrangement made by his sister Clara, who lived in Missouri and worried about him in the way only sisters can, with love and persistence, and a complete willingness to go around the person's stated wishes when she felt it was necessary. Clara had written to a boarding house in Kansas City, where she knew a widow named Mrs. Hooper who knew Winifred Merriweather, who was 28 years old, a schoolteacher, recently orphaned, and according to Mrs. Hooper, possessed of more practical courage and genuine warmth than any three women put together. Clara had provided Alfred's particulars without his knowledge or consent, and had then sent him a letter explaining what she'd done, which arrived the same week as Winifred's introduction. Alfred's first instinct had been to write back and decline the entire arrangement. He sat at his kitchen table for 4 evenings with that intention clearly held, and on the 5th evening he opened Winifred's letter again and read the part that had kept pulling at him. She had written, "I am not looking for rescue, Mr. Garrett. I am not looking for a man to tell me who I am or what I can do. I am looking for land that is worth the effort of caring for it, and a person who knows what effort actually means. If you are that person, I would be grateful to correspond. If you are not, I am perfectly capable of finding my own way, and I wish you well regardless." Alfred had read that passage 6 times. Then he had written back. They corresponded for 2 months. His letters were careful and factual: the acreage, the cattle count, the house dimensions, the distance from the nearest town. Hers were observant and direct, and occasionally contained a dry wit that caught him off guard, and made him set the letter down and look at the wall for a moment before continuing. She wrote once, "You describe your land the way a man describes something he loves but has convinced himself he should not love too loudly. I recognize the habit. I have done the same with people." He did not know what to do with that sentence, so he said nothing about it in his reply. In October, he wrote asking if she would be willing to come. He was careful to frame it as a practical arrangement. There was work to be done. The house needed a competent hand. He was not a young man anymore, and 36 was not 30. He did not mention what he was actually asking, because he was not certain he could put it into words that wouldn't embarrass them both. Winifred wrote back and accepted. She arrived on the 7th of November, 1883, on the afternoon stage from Amarillo, which Alfred met in the Tascosa town square with his second-best horse and the clean shirt he'd ironed twice. He recognized her from the description. Clara had passed along dark hair, medium height, brown eyes with a quality he would later struggle to name, but which he initially categorized as simply alert. She saw him before he saw her, and she was already walking toward him when he spotted her coming down off the stage step, carrying a trunk that was clearly too heavy for one person and refusing the driver's offered hand. "Mr. Garrett," she said. "Miss Merriweather," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. The afternoon sun was warm for November. A dog was barking somewhere down the street. "The trunk has my books in it," she said. "That's why it's heavy. I won't apologize for them." "I didn't ask you to," he said. He picked up the trunk. It was, in fact, extremely heavy. The ride out to the property was mostly quiet. Alfred had prepared several topics of conversation and discarded each one before it reached his mouth. Winifred sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the country open up around them, the great flat reach of the Panhandle grassland going gold in the late light, the sky enormous and cloudless, and the particular deep blue of November in West Texas. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said. "Most people find it oppressive at first." "I don't find it oppressive," she said. She was looking straight ahead, and there was something in her face he didn't know how to read yet. "I find it honest." Alfred said nothing. Something shifted very slightly in his chest. When they arrived at the property, he showed her the house, the 4 rooms he'd built. The kitchen with its iron cookstove, the bedroom he'd prepared for her with a new cotton quilt he'd had to ride to Amarillo to purchase, the sitting room with its single bookshelf, the small room off the back that he used as a kind of office, and which he had tidied with a thoroughness that would have alarmed him had he stopped to notice it. She moved through the rooms carefully and without comment until she reached the kitchen and saw the window that looked out over the back field toward the creek. "This is the window you write about," she said. He had not expected her to remember that. He had mentioned the window in one of his earliest letters, months ago, a single sentence about October light. "Yes," he said. She stood at it for a long moment. Then she said, "It's exactly what you said." That night she cooked with the provisions he'd laid in beans and salt pork and cornbread, with dried apples stewed in sugar. The kitchen smelled the way Alfred had not allowed himself to imagine it might smell. He sat at the table and felt dangerously close to something he had no name for and wasn't ready to examine. Day one ended with a practical conversation about the household arrangements. He would continue sleeping in the main bedroom. She would take the smaller room off the back hallway, which he had prepared for her. They would determine what came next after they had both had time to assess the situation. He said this in a tone of deliberate practicality. She agreed with a matching tone. Both of them knew they were being very careful. The second day, Winifred woke before Alfred and had coffee on the stove by the time he came through the kitchen. This alone, the smell of coffee meeting him before he had to make it himself, was a thing so unexpectedly affecting that he stood in the doorway for 2 full seconds and had to remind himself to move. She put a cup in front of him and said, "I want to see all of it today, every acre." He had not expected that either. He had expected her to want to settle the domestic arrangements first, the kitchen, the provisions, the routine. He had not expected to spend the second day riding the full circuit of the property with her on a leaner's old dun mare that had since become simply the spare horse, showing her the fence lines and the creek and the cattle and the rocky north corner where the soil was poor and the grass went thin. She asked good questions, specific, observant questions about soil quality and water access and the winter range patterns of the cattle. She asked about the north fence, which had been repaired 3 times in the last year. He told her about the pressure from Harlan Coop's men, how Coop had been pushing east, buying up land when he could and strong-arming when he couldn't, and how the broken fence was likely not accidental. "Does he have any legitimate claim to your land?" she asked. "No," Alfred said, "not 1 inch of it. But he wants it." "The creek," Alfred said. "My creek is the only reliable water source for 20 miles in certain directions. If he owns this land, he controls the water. That means he controls everything around it." Winifred was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek, the clear, cold water moving in the November light, the cottonwood trees stripped bare for winter but still impressive in their height. "He's been trying for 7 years, she said. "He started the year I arrived," Alfred said. "He seems to take it as a personal affront that I won't sell." She looked at Alfred. "Good," she said crisply. He almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come to it in a long time. The third day, Winifred found the letters. She was not snooping. She had asked permission to reorganize the kitchen shelves, and in the process of moving a loose board at the back of the lower shelf, she discovered a small tin box that had worked its way into the gap behind it. She brought it to Alfred without opening it, and he recognized it immediately and felt something cold move through him. "You can leave that," he said. She set it on the table and looked at him. "Is it yours?" "Yes." "Then I wasn't going to open it." He looked at the box. Then he said, "Letters, old ones." She waited. She did not ask. That he would later understand was one of the most important things she did. She waited, and she did not fill the silence with assumptions or pressure, and this was a skill he had encountered so rarely in his life that he did not initially recognize it for what it was. "There was supposed to be someone else," he said, "before you, 7 years ago when I came here." "She didn't come," Winifred said, not a question. "She wrote to say she'd married someone else," Alfred said. 3 weeks after I'd built the second room expecting her." A long pause. The stove ticked. Wind moved against the kitchen window. "I'm sorry," Winifred said. And she said it without any trace of the thing Alfred had half expected, that performing female sympathy that is really just the wish that you would stop talking about difficult things. She said it like she meant precisely those two words and nothing else. Alfred put the box back on the shelf. He said, "It was a long time ago." 7 years is not always a long time, Winifred said quietly. Then she went back to the shelves. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after that, feeling the way you feel when someone has said something accurate about you that you have spent years refusing to say to yourself. It was not comfortable. It was something better than comfortable. The fourth day brought snow, an early storm that rolled in from the north overnight and left 8 inches by morning. Alfred woke to find Winifred already outside, moving the cattle to the south pasture shelter with a competence he had not anticipated, and which required him to reassess several assumptions he'd been maintaining without knowing it. She had been raised on a farm in Ohio before moving to Kansas City to teach. She had told him this, but he had not quite integrated it into his picture of her. He went out and helped. They worked side by side in the snow and the sharp cold air, and somewhere in the middle of that work, moving cattle through drifts, repairing the shelter door that had swung loose in the night wind, carrying extra hay from the barn, the particular awkwardness of two strangers sharing a space began to break up and drift away like the snow clouds after noon. When they came inside, Winifred made a soup with dried beans and the last of the salt pork and some wild onions she had found along the creek the day before and dried in the kitchen window. Alfred ate 2 bowls without speaking and then said, "Where did you learn to move cattle?" "Same place I learned everything useful," she said. "By doing it wrong first and paying attention to what happened." He looked at her across the table. Her cheeks were still red from the cold. There was a strand of dark hair across her forehead that had escaped from its pins. She met his look without moving. "You're different from what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He considered the honest answer. "Someone more cautious," he said, "more waiting to be told." She raised an eyebrow. "I told you in my first letter I'm not that kind of person." "You did," he said. "I read it at least 6 times. Something shifted in her face, a softness quickly controlled. 6 times, she said. "I was deciding whether to believe you." "And now I believe you," he said. The storm kept them in for the rest of the day, and they spent the evening in the sitting room, Alfred reading a surveying manual, Winifred unpacking the books she had brought and arranging them on the single shelf, and on the floor around it because the shelf was not large enough. He watched her over the top of his manual. She had strong hands. She moved with a kind of purposeful ease that suggested someone who had made peace with taking up space in the world, which was unusual enough in a woman of 1883 that Alfred found it remarkable. She pulled out a volume of poetry, Whitman, and sat down across from him and began to read. The fire popped and settled. The wind pushed at the windows. Alfred realized he had been staring at the same page of his surveying manual for 20 minutes. He said abruptly, "Miss Merriweather." "Winifred," she said without looking up. "We are past the Miss Merriweather stage, I think." He accepted that. "Winifred, do you regret coming?" She looked up then. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which he appreciated. "No," she said. "Do you regret asking me?" He thought about the letters. He thought about the tin box. He thought about 7 years of a house full of nothing but his own breathing and the wind outside. "No," he said. She went back to her reading. He went back to not reading his manual. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the land that Alfred Garrett had held alone for 7 years was very quiet and warm, and for the first time in a long time did not feel like something he was simply enduring. The 5th day, Harlan Coop came for the first time. He rode in alone. His men stayed on the ridge, and Alfred met him in the yard with a hand on his belt and no expression on his face. Coop was a big man in his mid-50s, silver-haired and handsome, in the way of men who have used their handsomeness as a tool for so long that it has hardened into something colder than charm. "Garrett," he said from his horse. "I've got a fair offer ready, better than fair, better than anything you'll find for land out here." "I'm not selling," Alfred said. Coop's eyes moved to the house, to the kitchen window where Winifred was visible, a dark head bent over the table, apparently writing. "Got yourself company," he said. Alfred said nothing. "Wise move," Coop said, nodding slowly. "Man alone out here gets all kinds of accidents, broken fences, strayed cattle, that sort of thing." He let the suggestion sit in the air between them. "A partner might help with that." "Get off my land," Alfred said. Coop smiled and turned his horse and rode back up the ridge to join his men. Alfred watched him go and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that 7 years of fighting Harlan Coop had taught him to live with. But underneath it, something new, not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. A new vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Something that could be used against him now that hadn't existed a week ago. He went inside. Winifred was at the table. She had been writing, but she looked up immediately and said, "That was Harlan Coop." "Yes. He threatened you." "He implied future accidents." She set down her pen. "Alfred." It was the first time she had used his name without the prefix, and he noticed it the way you notice a sound you've been waiting to hear without knowing you were waiting. "What exactly does he want?" He sat down across from her and told her all of it, the full 7 years, the whole shape of the problem. The creek, the water rights, the 3 purchase offers he'd refused, the broken fences. The time 2 years ago when someone had poisoned the North Pasture well, which he'd never been able to prove was Coop's men, but which he knew the way you know things you cannot say aloud in a county court. He told her about Sheriff Pat Daly, who was Coop's man in all but name, and about the judge in Amarillo who was better but could be slow to act when the paperwork was complicated. He told her everything, and she listened to all of it with her elbows on the table and her chin resting on her linked hands and her brown eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she said, "He's going to try to forge a deed." Alfred looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because everything else has failed," she said. "He's been patient for 7 years. Patient men who run out of patience don't get loud, they get clever. And the cleverest thing he can do in this county with this judge is produce a document." She paused. "I taught a land law unit to my students every spring in Kansas City. Property disputes in territories and new states. The mechanisms are the same everywhere." Another pause and her eyes sharpened. "If he produces a false deed, you need to be able to demonstrate it's false before Sheriff Daly can act on it." "What would you need?" Alfred stared at her. "You taught land law." "To children," she said, "which means I had to understand it well enough to make it simple. What would you need?" He thought, "The original survey numbers on my deed. If his deed references the wrong survey markers, it falls apart. But to show that, you'd need someone who knows the surveying records." "Who keeps those?" "The county land office, but the clerk there is Coop's cousin." Winifred was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who keeps the federal records?" Alfred looked at her for a long moment. "The General Land Office," he said slowly, "in Amarillo. Can you get to Amarillo and back in a day, 2 days if I push?" "Then you need to go," she said, "before he moves. I'd be leaving you alone." "I have been alone before," she said, and there was nothing dramatic in the way she said it, just fact. Just the simple truth of a woman who had been managing alone for 3 years since her parents died, and who did not find solitude frightening, only sometimes lonely, which was an entirely different thing. Alfred went to Amarillo on the 6th day. He took his fastest horse and his good coat and his deed in the inner breast pocket of his jacket. He rode before sunrise. Winifred stood in the yard in the pale pre-dawn and watched him go, and he looked back once, which was not something he had planned to do. He returned late on the night of the 6th day with certified copies of the original survey records from the federal office, stamped and signed, identifying every marker on his property to the inch. He had also, while in Amarillo, visited a lawyer he trusted named Cornelius Webb, who had confirmed Winifred's assessment precisely. If Coop moved with a deed, the survey markers were the key. He came home to a house with the lamp on in the window. He sat with that for a moment before he brought the horse around to the barn. A lamp in the window. He had ridden toward nothing but darkness for 7 years. He unsaddled the horse in the dark and fed him and stood in the barn for a moment afterward, doing nothing, just breathing, just processing the way everything had changed in 6 days in ways he couldn't yet fully articulate. When he came inside, Winifred was at the stove with something warming in the pan, and she turned when he came through the door, and the way her face opened when she saw him, not a smile exactly, something more specific than a smile hit him somewhere directly behind the sternum with considerable force. "You got the records," she said. It was not a question. He put the papers on the table. She looked at them, turned them in her hands, read the relevant sections with a focused attention that would have looked professional on a lawyer, and then set them down and looked at him. "Good," she said. "Sit down. You've been writing all day." He sat down. She put food in front of him. He ate. She sat across from him and they talked, not about Coop, not about the land, but about Amarillo, which she had not seen, and about the ride, and about a hawk he'd seen circling the canyon rim in the early morning light, and about small things that meant nothing and everything at once. He noticed at some point that they were very comfortable together, comfortable in the way that is rare and not manufactured, the way that feels like something has simply settled into the right shape. It was on the 6th night, after the food was cleared and the papers were put away, that Winifred set her hands flat on the table and said, "Alfred, I need to say something." He waited. "I came here as a practical arrangement," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I came because I needed somewhere to go and you needed someone here and it made sense on paper." "Yes," he said. "But," she said, and she stopped and looked at the table for a moment and then back up at him. "It doesn't feel like paper anymore." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that only exists between two people who are saying things that are too large for the room. Alfred said, carefully, "No, it doesn't." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not going to make this into something it isn't, and I'm not going to pretend to feel things I don't feel. But I also am not willing to pretend I don't feel what I do feel, because I have done that before and it is an enormous waste of a person's life." "What do you feel?" he asked. He had not asked something so direct in 7 years. He felt it in his throat. Winifred Merriweather looked at Alfred Garrett across his kitchen table on the 6th night of her life on his land and said, "Like this is where I'm supposed to be, which frightens me, because I am very much aware that I've only been here 6 days, and that is not a reasonable amount of time to know something like that. 7 years is not a reasonable amount of time to stop believing something is possible," he said, "and I did it anyway. I don't think reasonable is the measurement that applies here." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said finally, "I don't think it is either." They sat together for a long time after that. The fire burned down. The wind moved outside. Neither of them said anything else that night, but neither of them moved to leave the table until it was very late. And when they did, Alfred took her hand in the doorway of the sitting room, one brief, careful grip, and then let go, and went to his room, and lay in the dark for a long time thinking about the specific texture of her fingers and the way she had looked at him when she said it didn't feel like paper anymore. The 7th day arrived like a hammer. It began with the sound of horses, too many horses, moving too fast for a morning social call. Alfred was out of bed and at the door before the sound fully registered, gun in hand, the old automatic instincts of 7 years of fighting for this land already running ahead of his conscious mind. Harlan Coop came over the ridge with 8 men, and the sheriff's deputy, a young man named Ellis who had the look of someone who knew he was being used wrong and had decided to accept it anyway, rode at the front carrying a folded document. Alfred stepped onto the porch. A moment later, Winifred was beside him, and he didn't have time to tell her to go back inside before she was already there, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the morning cold, and he realized that even if he'd had time, he wasn't certain he would have said it. There was something in her presence beside him on that porch that felt like the first solid thing he'd stood on in 7 years. Deputy Ellis rode forward and held up the document. "I've got a deed of conveyance, Mr. Garrett," he said, with the careful voice of a man reciting a prepared speech. Signed by Judge Beaumont in Tascosa, transferring title of this property to Mr. Harlan Coop on the basis of a prior claim predating your purchase. That document is fraudulent, Winifred said. Ellis blinked. He had not been looking at her. Ma'am, the survey markers on whatever deed Coop has presented will not match the federal survey records for this property, she said, loudly enough for every man on those horses to hear. We have certified copies from the General Land Office in Amarillo that arrived yesterday. The real question is whether Judge Beaumont reviewed those records before signing that order, and if he didn't, then either he was deceived or he was complicit. The silence that followed was considerable. Coop's face had gone very still. Garrett, he said, move the woman and let's discuss this like. I will not move, Winifred said, and you will not speak to him as though I'm a piece of furniture. Alfred lowered his gun, not because the situation was safe, but because he was suddenly aware that the gun was not the tool that was going to win this moment. We have federal records, he said. We have a lawyer in Amarillo who has already been contacted. If you ride onto my land or force that order, every one of those actions will be on the record, and the federal office will send a marshal. This was the gamble. Alfred had sent a telegram from Amarillo at Cornelius Webb's suggestion, alerting the federal land office to a potential fraudulent deed claim on this property. The marshal was not guaranteed and certainly not immediate, but the telegram was real and the threat had weight. Coop studied him. He studied Winifred. He was a man who had always known which way a fight was going to go before it went there, and Alfred watched him make his calculation. Ellis, Coop said finally, we'll take this back to the judge. Ellis looked deeply relieved. Yes, sir. Coop looked at Alfred one last time. This isn't finished, he said. It's finished today, Alfred said. Coop pulled his horse around and rode back over the ridge, and his 8 men followed him, and Deputy Ellis folded the document back into his coat with the expression of a man who hoped he would never have to do anything like this again. When they were gone, the silence was enormous. Alfred became aware that his heart was working very hard. He became aware of Winifred beside him, of the flour dust on her dress, of the fact that she had planted herself between him and a fraudulent legal order as calmly as she had done everything else in 7 days. He turned to look at her. She was watching the ridge where Coop's horses had disappeared. You could have been hurt, he said. He wasn't going to shoot anyone with a federal land dispute already logged in Amarillo, she said. You couldn't have been certain of that. She turned and looked at him. Her brown eyes were very direct. No, she said. I couldn't, but I was not willing to let him take this from you. A pause. From us. That word hung between them in the morning air. Alfred Garrett looked at Winifred Merriweather standing on the porch of his house. The house he had built board by board with his own hands in a territory most people had written off. The house he had maintained alone for 7 years against drought and rustlers and loneliness, and a man who wanted to take it from him, and he felt something open in his chest like a window thrown wide after a long winter. Come inside, he said. His voice was not quite steady. Come inside. I need to tell you something. She followed him in. He closed the door. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with his back to her, gathering the particular words he had been assembling without realizing it for 7 days, sorting through them the way you sort through lumber looking for the piece that is exactly right, and then he turned. I have been alone here for 7 years, he said. Not because I wanted to be, because I did not know how to. I did not allow myself to want things I wasn't certain I could have after he stopped. After the first time. After a leaner, she said quietly. I built this house for someone who didn't come, he said. And then I went on building it anyway because I didn't know what else to do, and it has been good in its way. The land is real, the cattle are real, the creek is real, but it has been he searched for the word. An endurance, Winifred said. Yes, he said, an endurance. And then you arrived, and in 7 days he made a gesture that was not quite articulate but which somehow expressed what he meant. In 7 days this place has felt like something I am actually living in rather than maintaining, like a home rather than a post I am holding. He looked at her steadily. I do not want to go back to what it was before. I do not want you to leave. Winifred's face did something complicated, a sequence of small expressions moving across it too fast to read individually, but collectively amounting to something like the release of a breath she had been holding. I don't want to leave, she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands careful, like he was holding something that mattered enormously and could not afford to be careless with, and he kissed her. She reached up and gripped the front of his shirt with both hands, and the kiss was not tentative and it was not brief. And when it ended, they stood together in the kitchen of the house he had built alone, and the morning light came through the window above the sink, and the stove ticked, and the wind moved against the glass, and every bit of it felt exactly, precisely right. 7 days, she said against his jaw. 7 days, he agreed. She leaned back and looked at him. You know this isn't finished with Coop. I know. We're going to have to go to Amarillo together and take this before a proper judge. I know that too. Good, she said. Then she smiled, a real smile, not the controlled, careful one he'd been catching the edges of all week, but the full version, and it was devastating. Then feed the horses. I'll make breakfast. We have things to do. He fed the horses. She made breakfast. They ate together with the plans spread out on the table between them. The Federal Survey records, the deed, the notes he'd made on Cornelius Webb's advice, and talked through the strategy for Amarillo with a focused clarity that felt like a partnership that had been running for years rather than a week. He watched her across the table and thought that this was what it felt like to have someone beside you rather than simply someone occupying the same space. And the difference was so large he could not believe he had gone on for 7 years unable to name it. They rode to Amarillo 3 days later together. Cornelius Webb met them at his office and reviewed the Federal Survey records against the deed Coop had presented to Judge Beaumont. And the discrepancy was exactly what Winifred had predicted. The survey markers on Coop's deed referenced a numbering system that had been superseded before Alfred ever purchased his land, meaning the document had either been fabricated from very old records or referenced a previous defunct claim that had no legal standing. Webb filed a motion before the Amarillo Federal Circuit Court the same afternoon. Alfred and Winifred spent 2 nights at a boarding house in Amarillo, separate rooms, which felt rather formal given the conversation they'd had in the kitchen, but which Alfred respected because they were not yet married, and he was a man of a certain code, even a loosening one. On the second evening, they walked along the main street of Amarillo together and had supper at a restaurant that had tablecloths and candles, which Alfred found slightly absurd and Winifred found charming, and halfway through the meal she reached across the table and put her hand over his and said, I keep waiting to wake up. From what? From this, she said. From this feeling like something that is actually happening rather than something I am hoping for. He turned his hand over and held hers. It's happening, he said. She looked at him. You're very different from what I expected. You told me I was what you expected, he said. When you said the window was exactly what I'd said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh freely, not the controlled, careful sound she allowed herself when something was mildly amusing, but the real version surprised out of her. He liked it enormously. The window, yes, she said. But you, I expected someone more sealed shut. I was, he said, thoroughly. She squeezed his hand. I'm glad you opened. The court ruled in Alfred's favor 6 weeks later. It was not a speedy judgment by any measure, but it was thorough. The circuit judge declared Coop's deed fraudulent, voided the order issued by Judge Beaumont, and forwarded a complaint about Beaumont's conduct to the state bar. Sheriff Pat Daly was replaced by Spring, following an investigation into his relationship with Coop's land-grabbing enterprise that several other landowners in the county had been waiting for the right moment to bring forward. Once Alfred and Winifred's case opened the door, 3 other families came forward with their own grievances, and the entire structure of Coop's operation was exposed in a way that a single deed dispute would not have accomplished. Harlan Coop left Tascosa County in February of 1884. He went south toward the Rio Grande and was not heard from in those parts again. Alfred and Winifred were married in December, at the small church in Tascosa that Alfred had entered perhaps 4 times in 7 years, and which he entered on this occasion with Winifred's hand on his arm, and the particular expression of a man who has been given something back he had stopped believing he deserved. Winifred wore a dress the color of sage green that she had made herself from fabric brought from Kansas City, and her dark hair was pinned up with a small ivory comb that had been her mother's. She looked at Alfred when she came down the short aisle, and he looked back at her, and the minister later told his wife that in 30 years of performing weddings, he had rarely seen 2 people look at each other quite like that, as though they were solving something. Clara came from Missouri for the wedding. She was small and sharp-eyed, and she embraced Alfred with a fierceness that almost knocked him sideways, and then looked at Winifred and said, "Thank God." He needed someone impossible to ignore. "I'll take that as a compliment," Winifred said. "It was meant as one," Clara said. The winter of 1883 into 1884 settled over the property with that particular deep quiet that the Texas Panhandle reserves for its coldest months. Alfred and Winifred weathered it together, the cattle, the horses, the house, the long evenings with the fire and the books and the conversations that ranged across everything, from practical matters of soil improvement to Whitman's poetry, to the politics of land rights in the territories, to the specific mystery of what happened to the South pasture well when the temperature dropped below a certain point. He learned things about her he hadn't known yet. She could not whistle. She made her coffee far too strong. She slept very still. She had nightmares sometimes. He heard her once through the wall, a sharp sound followed by silence, and he lay awake afterward listening until he heard her settle, and in the morning he said nothing, just put the coffee in front of her. And she looked at him and seemed to understand that he'd heard and was not going to press her, and something in her eyes was grateful in a way she didn't put into words. She learned things about him, too. He talked more in the early morning than at any other time of day. He was impatient about small mechanical failures, a stuck latch, a warped door, and patient about large ones, cattle disease, weather damage, the kinds of catastrophes that smaller men would break against. He kept a Leaner's letter somewhere even now. She did not ask about it and he did not mention it, but she knew it existed and he knew that she knew, and that understanding was its own kind of intimacy. One evening in January, he came in from the barn later than usual and found her at the kitchen table with the tin box open in front of her. His heart seized. Then he saw that she had not opened a Leaner's letter. It was still folded exactly as he'd left it, but she had set it aside and was looking at the other things in the box. A photograph of his parents, a small brass compass that had belonged to his father, a river stone he'd kept since he was 10 years old for reasons he could no longer quite explain. She looked up when he came in. "I wasn't reading the letter," she said. "I know," he said. "I found this." She held up the compass. "It's beautiful." He sat down and told her about his father, a surveyor, from Ohio originally, who had died when Alfred was 22 and left him the compass and a belief in the value of knowing exactly where you stood. This was the longest he had talked about his father in years. Winifred listened with both hands around her coffee cup and her eyes steady on his face, and at the end she said, "He sounds like a man who understood that certainty is something you have to work for." "Yes," Alfred said. "That's exactly right." She set the compass down. She said, "Alfred, yes, I love you." He looked at her. She was watching him with the direct, patient steadiness that he had come to understand was simply who she was. Winifred Merriweather Garrett, who did not look away from things, who did not pretend, who said what she meant with the same careful precision she applied to everything that mattered. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know," he said. I have been building up to saying it. I'm slower at this than you." She smiled. "I know, I wasn't worried." "I love you," he said. It started before I was ready for it to start, which you probably know. "The look you gave me when I came through the door that first night," she said. "When I was at the stove. Was it that obvious?" "Only to me," she said, "because I was looking for it." He held her hand across the table in the lamplight with the fire burning down and the January wind outside pressing against the house he had built board by board, and he thought, "This is what the land was waiting for. This is what I was waiting for, without knowing what I was waiting for." In March of 1884, Alfred began work on the addition he'd been planning since December. The house needed a proper library. Winifred's books had overflowed the shelf and were stacked in organized columns along two walls of the sitting room, and it needed a larger kitchen. And as long as he was building, he thought there might be use for an additional room, though he said this part carefully, and Winifred looked at him with a small smile and said, "Yes, I expect there might be." Tomás Reyes came back that spring to help with the cattle, and he brought his younger brother Miguel, who was 19 and quiet and hardworking. Tomás had worked for Alfred 3 years before and knew the property well, and he liked Winifred immediately. He told Alfred after the first week, with characteristic directness, "She is good. She belongs here." Alfred had said, "I know." Tomás had looked at him and smiled the smile of a man who had watched something turn out right that he'd been uncertain about and said, "You look different." "Do I?" "You looked before like a man carrying everything alone," Tomás said. "Now you look like someone who has put some of it down." Alfred thought about this. "Yes," he said, "that's about right." The spring was good. The cattle came through the winter healthy and the new calves were strong. The creek ran high from the snowmelt, which was exactly what the south pasture needed. Alfred and Winifred rode the full circuit of the property every week, and she continued to ask good questions and make observations that changed the way he thought about things he'd been managing by habit rather than analysis. She noticed that the north fence was still weak at a particular post and suggested a different kind of anchor, a technique she'd seen used in Ohio on clay-heavy soil. He tried it. It held better than anything he'd done before. In the evenings, she was teaching Miguel Reyes to read. She had discovered that he'd had only 1 year of school and had a sharp mind that deserved better than the half-literacy he was working with, and she simply, without making any announcement about it, set aside 2 evenings a week after supper and worked with him at the kitchen table. Miguel was initially embarrassed, and then, as he began to progress, quietly proud. By May he was reading complete paragraphs from the Kansas City newspaper that arrived 3 weeks late but arrived. Alfred watched this from the doorway sometimes and felt the full weight of what Winifred was doing on this land, not just holding it with him, not just managing the house and the cattle and the legal battles, but making it into a place where people were treated as though their minds mattered. In June, she told him she was expecting. He had come in from the east fence line, a section that needed restringing after a heifer had broken through, and she was sitting on the porch step in the evening light with a completely calm expression on her face, and she said simply, "I have something to tell you." He sat down on the step beside her. "Tell me," she told him. Alfred Garrett sat in the warm June evening with his hands on his knees and felt something happen to his entire understanding of the future. A sudden expansion, like a room with another wall removed, like the country opening up around you when you ride over a ridge. He looked at Winifred. She was watching him with that patient steadiness of hers, waiting to know how he would receive this. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her in against his side, and he pressed his lips to her temple and he said, "Good." She laughed, that real laugh, the surprised one. "Good," she repeated. "Just good." "Wonderful," he said. "Extraordinary, the best possible news." "I am very poor at this, you know that." "I know," she said, leaning into him. "I love you anyway." "Good," he said again, and this time she didn't correct him. The pregnancy proceeded without complication through the summer and into the fall. Winifred continued working at her ordinary pace, managing the household, riding the south pasture with Alfred, teaching Miguel 2 evenings a week, corresponding with Clara in Missouri and with her old friend Mrs. Hooper in Kansas City. She slowed only gradually, and only when her body required it, and she accepted each limitation with the same practical lack of drama she applied to everything else. Alfred, for his part, discovered in himself a capacity for worry he had not known existed at this scale. He had not been a nervous man. He was not nervous now exactly, but he was extraordinarily attentive to her sleep, to her meals, to the distance between the house and the nearest doctor, which was 22 miles. He arranged with a woman in Tascosa named Mrs. Crawford, who had assisted in more than a dozen births in the county, to come out when the time came. He made this arrangement in September and felt somewhat better for having made it. In October, on a Wednesday evening with the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and the sky the particular deep blue of autumn in West Texas, the same blue he had tried to describe in his letters to Winifred, and which she had seen and recognized, their son was born. He was healthy and loud and deeply unimpressed with the world from the first moment, and he had Winifred's dark hair and Alfred's particular set to the jaw, and Alfred held him for the first time in the kitchen by the window that looked over the back field and felt something so large and specific move through him that he had no language for it at all. Mrs. Crawford smiled at him from across the room. "First one," she said. "Yes," he said. "You'll get used to it," she said. "The feeling doesn't go away, but you stop being so alarmed by it." Winifred from the bed said, "What are you going to call him?" They had discussed names. They had made a list. Alfred looked at the child in his hands, this small, emphatic, dark-haired proof that the land had a future, and said the name they'd agreed on. "James," he said. "James Merriweather Garrett." Winifred, who was tired in the way of someone who has done something tremendous, smiled. "Good," she said. "Good," Alfred agreed, and they both laughed. Clara came for Christmas that year and held James with the confidence of a woman who had been an aunt several times over, and she sat with Winifred in the sitting room while Alfred and her husband James Wicklund, a good-humored man with a red beard who followed Clara in most things with cheerful willingness, talked about cattle and fencing, and the new water system Alfred was planning to run from the creek to the south pasture. Clara said to Winifred, "He used to write to me once a month. Dutiful letters, very factual. The cattle are well, the fence was repaired, the winter is cold, for 7 years. He is factual," Winifred said. "He is," Clara agreed. "His letters are different now." Winifred looked at her. "He wrote me in October when James was born," Clara said. "It was 3 pages." She paused. "In 7 years he never wrote more than 1 page. In October he wrote 3 pages, and he described everything, the light in the room, the sound the baby made, the way you looked. 3 pages. Clara looked at Winifred with something clear and affectionate and deeply satisfied. "I wanted to come and see what you'd done." "I didn't do anything," Winifred said. "He was always capable of 3 pages. I think you knew that when the rest of us had stopped believing it," Clara said. Winifred thought about the letter she had written him, the first one, the one that had said she was not looking for rescue but for someone who understood what effort meant. She thought about how she had sat with Mrs. Hooper in the Kansas City boarding house and read Clara's description of Alfred Garrett, 36, alone, West Texas, land along a creek, and felt something in her respond before her rational mind had any reason to respond. "I recognized him," she told Clara, "from the letters. Even the first one. He described his land the way I feel about things I'm afraid to want too much. I recognized it." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He said something like that," she said. "In his letter. He said that you'd arrived, and in 7 days the land felt like something he was living in rather than defending." Winifred looked through the sitting room doorway to where Alfred was talking with James Wicklund, gesturing with a cup of coffee, explaining something about the creek's water table with the focused enthusiasm he showed whenever he talked about the land's mechanics. His face was open in a way that she suspected it had not been open in 7 years, and she thought, This is what I did not know I was going to. This is what all the practical courage and all the patience and all the willingness to walk toward an unknown thing had been building toward." She loved him in a way that had no drama to it, that was just structural now, like the boards of the house, like the survey lines of the land. It was simply how things were organized. "He's a good man," she told Clara. "He's the best man I know," Clara said, "and I'm his sister, so I'm allowed to be biased." The second year on the land was different from the first, not in the quality of its happiness, but in the texture. The urgency of the early days had settled into something more sustainable. Alfred and Winifred had found the rhythm of working the land together, and the rhythm of living together in the same house, which are related but not identical skills, and they had found it with less friction than either of them might have expected, partly because they were both people who preferred clarity to assumption, and partly because they had, from the beginning, talked to each other in a way that didn't leave large spaces for misunderstanding to grow in. There were tensions. There would have been in any life. Alfred was slow to change his methods on the land, not because he was stubborn, but because he'd spent 7 years developing them for good reasons, and occasionally Winifred's suggestions felt premature to him, even when they turned out to be right. Winifred was independent in a way that sometimes left Alfred feeling unnecessary, which was not her intention, but which he struggled with in the private way of a man who has a long habit of being the only person doing everything. They talked about these things, which was itself unusual enough in that time and place that Tomás Reyes once said to Miguel, with considerable respect, "Those two actually talked to each other," as though this were a remarkable phenomenon, which in 1884 West Texas it largely was. By the third year, Miguel Reyes could read with fluency, and had begun corresponding with a school in Amarillo about the possibility of further education, which came about because Winifred had written to them on his behalf without telling him until the reply arrived, and the reply was encouraging. Miguel had looked at the letter and then at Winifred with an expression that was too large for the moment and too honest to suppress. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I did not have to," she agreed, "but I wanted to." He went to Amarillo the following autumn and came back in the spring and then went again, and eventually became a teacher himself, a story that began in a kitchen on Alfred Garrett's property in the Texas Panhandle on a Wednesday evening with a Kansas City newspaper 3 weeks old. In 1886, when James was 2.5 and already demonstrating opinions about how things should be organized, Winifred told Alfred she was expecting again. This time he did not have to search for the response. He took her by the waist and lifted her briefly, carefully, mindful of the condition, and she laughed and said, "Put me down, I'm perfectly capable of standing." And he put her down and kissed her and said, "Wonderful, extraordinary, the best possible news." "Better," she said. Their second child, a girl named Clara Adelaide Garrett, Clara for Alfred's sister, and Adelaide for Winifred's mother, was born in February of 1887, in the same room and with the same Mrs. Crawford attending, during a snowstorm that made the 22 miles to Tascosa purely theoretical. She was smaller than James had been, but equally loud and equally opinionated, and by the age of 2 she was following Alfred around the property with a focused intensity that he found both exhausting and deeply moving, because she looked at the land the way he looked at it, as though it were something worth understanding. The land itself continued to improve. Alfred's creek-fed irrigation project, which he'd been developing since 1884, with advice from a farming pamphlet Winifred had ordered from a publisher in Philadelphia, transformed the South pasture from reliable winter range into productive year-round grazing. He expanded the herd. He hired a second permanent hand, a man named Bo Thornton from East Texas, who was steady and capable, and said almost nothing for the first 3 months, and then, once he'd established that Alfred was fair and Winifred was not to be underestimated, became easy and good to have around. The north fence, which had been the site of so many of Coop's depredations, was rebuilt entirely in 1885 with the anchor technique Winifred had suggested, and it held through every subsequent season without incident. It became a kind of symbol for Alfred without him ever saying so aloud. The fence rebuilt right, the perimeter secured, the land finally fully settled. The house grew. The library room was completed in 1884. A second bedroom for the children was added in 1887, when it became clear that Clara Adelaide had views about sharing space with her brother. The kitchen was expanded to accommodate the reality of a house that was now regularly full of people. Tomás and Miguel when they were on the property, Mrs. Crawford who came for the births, Clara and James Wickland from Missouri when they could make the trip, and occasionally a neighbor family from the county who had slowly shifted from regarding Alfred Garrett as a useful landmark to regarding the Garrett place as somewhere worth visiting. This last change was perhaps the one Alfred had not seen coming. He had been alone so long that he had stopped conceiving of himself as someone who could be the center of a community. But Winifred was instinctively hospitable in a way that had nothing to do with social performance and everything to do with a genuine interest in other people. She made people feel seen. She asked the right questions and remembered the answers. She organized a small lending library from her own collection that county families could borrow from, operating on the honor system, which Alfred had doubted would work and which worked perfectly. She started a monthly letter-reading afternoon for women in the county who wanted to keep up with news from the eastern states, and this began as 4 people in her kitchen and grew to 12 by the 3rd year. The Garrett property became known in the county not just as the land along the reliable creek, but as the place where things were done fairly and where people were welcome. Alfred, who had built the land's reputation on solidity and quiet competence, found this addition to it both slightly alarming and deeply right. He told Winifred once, lying in the dark after a particularly full Sunday with visitors, "I don't know how you do it." "Do what?" "Make everyone feel like they're meant to be here." She was quiet for a moment. "I just pay attention," she said. "People need to feel like they're being seen. It's not complicated." "It is, though," he said. "Most people don't manage it." She turned toward him in the dark. "You see me," she said. "You've seen me from the beginning, even when you were being very careful about not showing it. I was not subtle." "You were," she said. "You were just not quite subtle enough." He found her hand in the dark and held it. Outside, the autumn wind moved against the house, the same wind that had moved against it for 11 years now, that he had learned to read the way you read a person you know well. He listened to it and to the house, to James sleeping in his room down the hall, to Clara Adelaide's occasional small sound, to the creak of the roof settling in the temperature drop of night. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I was wrong," he said. "For 7 years. Not about the land was always worth holding, but about believing. I told myself that the first time with Eleanor was the lesson, that the lesson was to want less, to need less from this life than I had started out wanting." He felt her hand tighten in his. "I was wrong about that." "I know you were," she said gently. "I want you to know that I know it," he said, "because it matters, because you are, because what you've done here." "Alfred," she said. "What?" "You are doing a very good job of saying something you couldn't have said 7 years ago," she said. "I love you. I know what you mean. You don't have to find the perfect words." He thought about his father's compass. "You have to work for certainty. I want to find the perfect words," he said. "Then," she said with that smile in her voice that he had come to know even in the dark, "tell me in the morning. You're better in the early mornings." He laughed. It surprised him, the ease of it, the laugh, the easy release of it in the dark. 7 years ago, in this same house, in this same room, he had lain in the dark unable to name what was missing. Now he knew exactly what it was, and it was here. "In the morning," he said. In the morning he did tell her, over coffee that was still too strong, with James eating his cornmeal at the table, and Clara Adelaide attempting to hand-feed some of hers to the dog, which Alfred had told her not to do, and which she continued to do with the selective hearing of a child who has decided that certain rules are suggestions. Alfred told Winifred across the table and the cornmeal and the dog and the noise of a house that was entirely, completely, structurally full of life. He told her what she had given him, which was not the land or the house or even herself, though all of these were gifts he did not take lightly. He told her that she had given him back the belief that a person could want the full version of things, the complete life, the real home, The love that was not careful management of a safe distance but actual closeness, actual necessity, actual choice made every day again. She listened with her coffee cup in both hands and James occasionally interrupting to report something about the dog. When Alfred finished, she set down her cup and looked at him in the morning light, the October light, the same light she had recognized in his first letter, and said, "I knew from your letters you were this. I just needed you to know it too." 7 days, he said. 7 years and 7 days, she said. They had 2 more children after Clara Adelaide. In 1889, a boy named Thomas Henry Garrett, called Tom by everyone immediately, and named for no one in particular except that it suited him. He was a round, placid child who slept well and smiled readily, and was adored by his older siblings in the way you adore a small creature who asks nothing difficult of you. And in 1892, their youngest, a girl named Rose Ellen Garrett, who arrived in May with the bluebonnets blooming along the creek and who had Alfred's green-gray eyes in Winifred's face, and who was, from the beginning, interested in plants, specifically in which ones were edible and which ones were not, a passion she pursued with a scientific thoroughness that eventually led her, but that is later. And this story is about the land and the 7 years and the 7 days, and what comes after when everything held alone is finally shared. The property in 1893 was 3 times the enterprise it had been in 1876. Alfred had purchased the adjacent 40 acres to the northeast property that had been Coop's intended expansion corridor, now bought cheap from the estate of its original owner, who'd finally given up and gone east. He had expanded the creek irrigation to cover the new acres and built a proper bunkhouse for the hands. He had acquired a mechanical hay press, which was an extraordinary luxury, and which Winifred had approved with the comment that if it saved 2 weeks of labor in August, it was worth every cent. She had, over the same years, built something that she had not planned and had not exactly intended, but which had become as real as the fence lines and the irrigation channels. She had become the person in that county that people came to when they needed a letter written, or a document explained, or a child taught to read, or a legal question, answered in plain terms by someone who had no financial interest in the answer. Women came to her when they needed someone to think through a problem with. Men came sometimes too, more reluctantly, but they came. Alfred watched this happen over the years and felt a pride that was so specific and uncomplicated that he had no need to say it often, because it was simply present in everything. In the way he spoke about her to anyone who asked, in the way he deferred to her assessment on complex questions, in the way he made sure the kitchen was the largest room in the house. He told her once, "You were a school teacher when you arrived." "I still am," she said. "You're more than that." "I'm the same," she said. "I just have more students." He thought about the county as it had been in 1876, scattered and raw, and holding itself in the difficult way of things that haven't yet decided whether they intend to persist. He thought about it now, in 1893, with its farmers and ranchers, and the families who had come and stayed and built something, because the land rewarded the people who were willing to understand it rather than simply use it. He thought about Winifred's lending library and her letter-reading afternoons, and the way she had managed, with no fanfare and no stated ambition, to make this particular corner of the Texas Panhandle into a place where people knew their neighbors, and where a woman's opinion in a room was not automatically the least important voice in it. He thought about all of this, and he thought, she did not save this land. I had already saved the land, 7 years of holding it alone against Harlan Coop and drought, and everything else the Panhandle offered. What she did was save what the land was for. She showed up and made it feel like home in 7 days, and then she spent 10 years making it a home worth having for him, for the children, for the county, for the particular version of Alfred Garrett who had been waiting under all those years of necessary solitude to be called forward again. He was 50 in 1897. He didn't feel it particularly, though his back informed him of certain opinions on cold mornings. Winifred was 42, which she said was far too interesting an age to spend worrying about, and which showed in her face as something better than youth, a kind of illuminated steadiness, like a lamp that has been burning long enough to have found the best angle. James Merriweather Garrett was 13 and already working the land with a seriousness that both pleased Alfred and occasionally alarmed him, because he recognized in the boy his own capacity for single-minded focus and hoped to also pass on the lesson it had taken him until 36 to learn, that focus on a thing is not the same as a life worth living, and that a person needs other people the way land needs water. He told James this inexpertly on a morning when they were riding the east fence together, and James looked at him with the focused attention he gave everything and said, "I know, Pa, that's what Ma says too." Alfred laughed. "Good," he said. Clara Adelaide was 10 and still following Alfred around the property with her observational intensity, but she had also, recently, added her mother's books to her investigation of the world. She was reading things 3 years above what Alfred would have guessed her age bracket required, and asking questions that nobody had answered to her satisfaction yet, which Winifred treated as a promising sign, and Alfred treated as a reminder to order more books from the Philadelphia publisher. Tom was 8 and conducted his life with a peace that Alfred found baffling and admirable. He was the sort of person who makes rooms calmer simply by being in them, and Alfred had no idea where this came from but was deeply grateful for it. Rose Ellen was 5 and was currently in the process of having convinced their neighbor's son, a serious child named Frederick Hale, that all the interesting plants along the creek were her personal research project, and he was merely permitted to assist. Alfred had watched this negotiation occur over 2 afternoons and had mentioned it to Winifred, who had laughed and said, "She learned it from me." And Alfred had said, "What part?" And Winifred had said, "Deciding what's yours and being straightforward about it." And Alfred had thought about a woman stepping off a stage in Tascosa with a trunk full of books and refusing the driver's hand, and said, "Yes, she did." The November of 1897, 21 years after Alfred had ridden into the Texas Panhandle with $43 and a borrowed horse, was a warm one. The cottonwoods along the creek were late-going gold, and the afternoons were long and amber and soft in the way of a climate that is reluctantly releasing summer. Alfred rode the property alone one morning, not because Winifred was unavailable, but because he wanted to hold the shape of it in his mind the way he had held it in those early years when the holding of it was itself the daily work. He rode the full circuit. He noted the fence lines, which held. He checked the irrigation channels, which ran clear. He counted the cattle, which were healthy and plentiful. He stopped at the north corner, where the post Winifred had suggested anchoring differently still held as solid as anything on the property, and he stood there for a moment with the Panhandle wind, doing what the Panhandle wind always did, pressing against everything, and finding it more permanent than expected. He had held this land alone for 7 years. He thought about those 7 years not with regret, exactly, but with the clear-eyed assessment of a man who has the perspective that comes from standing on the other side of something. Those 7 years had made the land what it was. They had made him what he was, the particular capacity he had for sustained effort, for working alone without complaint, for sitting with difficulty without giving it more room than it needed. He did not disown those years. They had been necessary, but they had not been enough. They had been the foundation, and the foundation was only the beginning. He turned his horse toward the house. From the north, coming over the ridge where Harlan Coop had once brought 8 men and a fraudulent deed, he could see the full property laid out below him in the morning light. The house with its additions, the bunkhouse, the barn, the south pasture where Beau Thornton was already moving cattle with the easy competence of a man who has found the work that suits him. He could see the kitchen window, the window that looked out over the back field toward the creek, the window that Winifred had stood at on her first evening and said was exactly what he described. He could see through it, the dim, warm shape of lamplight, because Winifred was already in the kitchen, and the kitchen had a lamp lit. And the lamp had been lit in that window for 14 years now, so consistently that Alfred sometimes forgot to notice it, and sometimes, like this morning from the ridge, it hit him with the full force of something that had never fully lost its power to move him. He rode down toward it, toward the warmth, toward the house that had been a holding and was now a home. Winifred was at the kitchen table when he came in, writing a letter to Clara in Missouri. He saw the thick, familiar pages of a correspondence that had been running since before he and Winifred were married, and which Clara had told him was the best letter in her collection, which he had found oddly moving. She looked up when he came through the door, and her face did the thing it had always done, that small, specific opening, not a full smile but the beginning of one, the thing that meant she was glad he was back. "All well," she said. "All well," he said. He hung his coat. He poured himself the coffee she had left warming on the stove. He sat down at the table across from her, and she went back to her letter, and he sat with his coffee and looked at her. At the woman who had arrived on a November afternoon with a trunk full of books, and refused the driver's hand, and stood in his kitchen that evening looking at the window and said, "This is exactly what you said," and he thought the thing he thought every day in some form, which was that nothing about this had been guaranteed and everything about it had been right. "What?" she said without looking up from her letter. "Nothing," he said. She looked up. She knew his nothing. "Alfred, I was thinking," he said, "that I would like to be buried on the north corner." She set down her pen. "We are not discussing where you're going to be buried. It's a reasonable thing to discuss. You are 50 years old and in perfectly good health, and I refuse," she said, with the crisp directness that he had loved since the first letter. "If you want to discuss something, discuss why you rode out alone this morning without telling me you were going." "I wanted to see the whole thing," he said, "from the ridge, the way you can see it all from up there." She studied him for a moment with those brown eyes. And it's good," he said. "It's very good, everything we built." Her face softened. "Yes," she said, "it is." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had taken it for 14 years with the same care, because she still mattered to him with the specific, exact quality of someone who has never become a background fact. She turned her hand and held his. Outside, the Panhandle wind moved over the grass, and the creek ran cold from the October snowmelt in the high country to the north, and the cottonwoods along the bank were finally, this late November morning, going gold. James was at the south pasture with Beau. Clara Adelaide was reading in the sitting room with the focused ferocity that already told you everything about who she was going to become. Tom was somewhere being peaceful about it. Rose Ellen was at the creek with her research. The house around them held everything in, the bookshelf that had become 3 bookshelves and a library room. The kitchen table where 2 strangers had become partners had become family. The window where the morning light came in at exactly the angle that Alfred had described in a letter to a woman he didn't know yet, a description she had read and recognized and crossed a territory to see for herself. He had held that land alone for 7 years. She had shown up and made it feel like home in 7 days. And then they had spent the rest of it, every year after, every cold morning and hard season, an easy summer and child and letter and lamplight evening, and cup of coffee too strong, spending what they'd found together, building it larger, holding it between them the way you hold something that is real and hard-won and worth every year of effort that led to it. Neither of them would have called it miraculous. They were not the kind of people who used that word. They would have said it was work, and it was also love, and in the end, in the long end of a life on the land they had made together, those 2 things had turned out to be the same. Winifred squeezed Alfred's hand across the kitchen table and went back to her letter to Clara. Alfred drank his coffee and looked at the window. The light was good. It always was, this time of morning in October, on this piece of land along the creek in the Texas Panhandle that a man had once ridden toward with $43 and a belief that effort was the beginning of something worth having. He had been right. He just hadn't known yet the full shape of what it would become. Now he did. And the knowing of it, The full settled knowing of it after all those years was something he carried quietly and completely, the way good land holds water deep and ready, and enough for everything that grows on it.